This is the story of how a vast swathe of virgin African wilderness was contorted into one of the biggest cattle ranches in the world, and then painstakingly transformed back again against all odds. It's about how the sport hunting of one wildlife species is paying for the protection of another highly endangered species. It's also an account of how a living laboratory is formulating a land use model that could be implemented across the continent, but whose survival is under threat from a foreign government's misguided legislation. Towards the end of the 1950s, a small group of cattle ranchers who were also committed wildlife conservationists pioneered the game ranching industry in Zimbabwe. The idea developed from the theory that a spectrum of wild animals is ecologically more efficient at producing meat and byproducts than a single domestic species. The theory was untested, and considerable business risks were taken and many frustrations endured before game ranching was proved to be a viable land use alternative. The country's Wildlife Conservation Act 1960 paved the way for the introduction of game ranching in Zimbabwe. The Parks and Wildlife Act of 1975 consolidated the process into a workable legal framework. This act was revolutionary in that the ownership of wildlife was transferred from the state to the appropriate authority of the land, with the exception of specially protected species. Critics of the act predicted the end of game outside of national parks, but in fact, wildlife flourished. The country's Department of National Parks and Wildlife Management supported the fledgling game ranching industry through the capture and translocation of thousands of animals from parks estate onto private land. This enabled the ranchers to stock their land cheaply. The early emphasis on game ranching was on cropping. It was imperative to produce good quality meat, as it had to compete with beef. Most outlets were a considerable distance from the game ranches. The meat had to be on the market within 36 hours of slaughter, which created the need for well-equipped butcheries with meat freezing facilities. By the mid-1960s, game ranchers looked towards recreational sport hunting as a source of revenue. Most hunters were local or South African, as Zimbabwe could not compete for overseas clientele with other well-established safari destinations in Africa. With sport hunting, the profitability of game ranching improved. Financially, cropping became of secondary significance. The overall attitude of cattle ranchers towards wildlife began to change. There was an increase in the number and spread of game, with its growing financial importance. The level of poaching declined with the employment of more game guards, as ranchers came to appreciate the value of their wildlife. With this, range management was greatly improved, and wildlife interests became an integral part of ranching programs. The Bubye Valley Conservancy is situated in the southern lowveld of Zimbabwe, not far from the Limpopo River, which forms the border with South Africa. Blondie Leatham is a tough, no-nonsense workaholic who has spent all his working life dedicated to wildlife conservation. He is also the general manager of the Bubye Valley Conservancy.
I spent 7 years in national parks, served on various stations. At the end of my time, I was based at Pools, which is central in the Zambezi Valley, and was in charge of the rhino protection operation that was in place at the time, Op Stronghold. I was put in that position because I had an ex-military background, and it was becoming an armed conflict with the poachers. So my last year and a half was spent mainly specializing on the rhino protection programs. I then left in '87 and moved down here to what was then a large cattle ranch, one of the largest in southern Africa. It was called Lemco Ranch and belonged to Unilever, which is a large British company. At that stage, they were realizing the importance of wildlife. So although the main economy of the ranch was still cattle, They had just started hunting operations, and I was taken on as a wildlife manager to improve their anti-poaching efforts, work along with the guy who was starting up the safari industry at that stage, and then also deal with problem animals, being mainly your predators, leopard, hyena. There were lion at that stage, but they were transient. So whenever they pitched up, they used to be tracked down and shot, because obviously they were in direct conflict with the cattle. When I arrived here in '87, they were busy recovering from a horrific drought which they had experienced in '82, '83, and busy building up the cattle numbers again to viable population. In '92, we experienced another devastating drought whilst I was here, and the cattle numbers were knocked down so far again that Unilever decided that it wasn't worth trying to revamp the populations again to a viable level. And that is when the cattle ranch was bought out by a number of shareholders who realized that it was probably the only chunk of land in Zimbabwe that was large enough to form a sustainable wildlife area. It's in Region 5, which is a low rainfall area, and because of the regular droughts, even cattle ranching was no longer viable. As and when they could, they included various properties around here and established what is now the Bubye Valley Conservancy, which is just over 850,000 acres.
In order to start reintroducing wildlife in the area, the Conservancy had to negotiate with the government's veterinary department. The main concern was control of the foot and mouth disease, which can be transmitted from buffalo to domestic cattle. A double electrified perimeter game fence 10 yards apart had to be erected around the Conservancy, a total of over 450 miles of fencing. This was a massive capital outlay for the shareholders of the Conservancy to make. It was important that the big 5 species, elephant, buffalo, rhino, lion and leopard, be re-established in the Conservancy. Leopard numbers were stable, but populations of the other 4 would have to be reintroduced. Buffalo was a key species, as not only is it a sought-after trophy animal by big game hunters, but it is also an important prey species for the lion. A number of herds were captured from different parts of the country and brought into the Conservancy. As the Conservancy began to take shape, elephants started to filter in from outlying areas, but it was decided to boost these numbers through translocation. During the mid-1980s, the rhino poaching scourge, which had raged across Africa, swept down from the north. With populations of both black and white rhinos decimated north of the Zambezi River, Zimbabwe's populations became increasingly more exposed. The authorities at that time decided to move vulnerable populations to intensive protection zones, IPZs, within the national parks and also onto private land. For the past 12 years, Natasha Anderson has been involved in rhino conservation in Zimbabwe. Today, she is the monitoring coordinator for the Lowveld Rhino Trust.
This conservancy was established purely on commercial grounds. In '92, the cattle industry collapsed due to the drought and they converted to game. And the foundation of that business was trophy hunting, because the game densities were so low. You cannot attract photographic tourists when you've got low game density. Post-2000, the photographic tourism industry in Zimbabwe collapsed completely. And so we were very fortunate that this area was actually a hunting area, and that hunting clients are a lot more robust in terms of what they expect of the places they visit. They're prepared to take more chances. Photographic tourists will very quickly divert from an area that has any sort of contention, doesn't need to actually be civil unrest. This population in Bubye Valley Conservancy was established starting in 2002 with black rhinos. It did have white rhinos previously. And we've just gradually rescued rhinos from very vulnerable areas where the poaching was reaching unsustainable levels, and have been able to put them in here. So if it wasn't for this area, we would have lost easily twice the number of rhinos that Zimbabwe has lost during this period. All of our animals are individually ear-notched, so we can see which individual is which, and we know our entire populations to the individual level. So the trackers that we have go out each day and we'll pick up rhino spoor, track the animal down till they get it visual, photograph it, identify it, record its GPS position, also other data on what the animal's been feeding on, what its condition is, has it got a calf. It's very important to monitor that sort of information on breeding rates. These are some of the most successful populations in the world in terms of breeding rates. They've been very settled populations, very low densities, so but socially linked. So there's nothing restricting their breeding. They've got plenty of nutrition. There's not social competition, negative competition, and you know we're having some intercalving intervals as good as 22 months, when you know 30 months is considered a good intercalving interval. So we're very fortunate with the breeding rates we're having here, and that's been very important in this period of high poaching pressure, because we have suffered dramatic losses, but the populations have actually been able to breed their way ahead of that. Whereas in the smaller populations that are most common in Zimbabwe now, where the population is 20 or 10, they cannot breed their way ahead of this poaching pressure, and they're very vulnerable. Most of them are actually sadly in decline now, whereas these larger populations are able to grow forward. Over 80% of the country's rhinos are now in private conservancies, more so because the populations in the IPZs have declined so dramatically through the poaching, and they've been able to better protect the populations in the private land areas through the fact that they weren't so dependent on tourism as the IPZs were. They were hunting-based industries, so they've managed to survive and maintain their protection effort more consistently through this period.
Norman English is the anti-poaching manager for the Bubye Valley Conservancy.
My background into this field of work is I joined national parks as a wildlife officer, and I worked there for 25 years. About 20 years of that I was actually involved with rhino anti-poaching operations, and on the formation of the intensive protection zones in 1993 I was posted into the Wankie area to set up the biggest IPZ in the country. The Bubye Valley Conservancy is about 3,000 square kilometers, and because of logistics we are divided into 4 sections. The Conservancy derives its whole income from hunting operations. We've got 7 or 8 camps operating in the Conservancy. Without the hunting there would be basically no reason for this area to exist, or it would be a cattle area. The hunting is the most viable form of land use for this area. Having this large unit of land set aside for wildlife has meant that endangered species like black and white rhinoceros thrive here. Got important populations of cheetah, wild dog as well, brown hyena, pangolins. So under the umbrella of hunting, this whole habitat is benefiting a whole variety of other species that are not consumptively hunted, but they're benefiting from this wildlife area. Without hunting we would be very hard put to justify keeping this big expansive land in its current land use. Conservancy covers all its own anti-poaching costs. It's quite an expensive operation running a big anti-poaching unit like this. We are a business, so we have to keep an eye on the bottom line. We have about 85 scouts total in the Conservancy. One of our main lines of detection here is that we've got a fenced perimeter. It's a double fence, game fence, and we have guys every 10 kilometers patrolling that daily. And that's our first line of defense. If we do detect an incursion of armed poachers, that's when we react from here.
Yesterday we had two poachers come in, definitely rhino poachers. The way they entered, the way they anti-tracked, and that is definitely just 2 armed guys after rhino. We were unable to locate them yesterday. They exited last night probably after 12 o'clock. So what we're doing now is we're backtracking to find where they've come from, to make sure they haven't done any damage. We also have other call signs tracking them from where they exit to find where they've gone, again in the hope that we might come up on them before they get picked up by a vehicle. All the scouts that we've picked up now, we're going to go and backtrack and just try and speed it up by leapfrogging back on their spoor. We'll deploy them in areas where we think the poachers came from, and they'll cross grain until they cut spoor and then start tracking it. They give us direction, we'll take another lot further inland, and by doing that we just speed up the process of backtracking and finding out what happened.
The game scouts followed the poachers' tracks back to their hideout and managed to apprehend them.
I'm going to tell him to leave scouts to secure that place where they've got that Mozambican guy and the other one, just so that nothing can be removed or disturbed, and then I'm going to ask him to go to that road and meet you there.
A high-powered hunting rifle, along with the horns of a black rhino cow and small calf, were recovered. The National Parks authorities and the police were called in order to arrest the poachers. Be Brave and LP are two orphaned black rhino that were rescued from the poacher's bullet and axe. During the day, a guard follows the two rhino through the bush. At night, the rhino are kept in a protective boma. Contact with humans is kept to a minimum so that their eventual release back into the wild is as natural as possible.
The Conservancy is important in this region. It supplies a huge amount of jobs. We have between 350 and 400 employees. It probably supports over 2,000 families. We also have aid programs where we formed what we call them Tutengwi Trust. We are currently funding the building of a clinic, supplying clean drinking water to one of the schools. Every year we drill and equip boreholes in the arid areas around here. To the north we have a system in place with the local community leadership, which are the chiefs, where we donate 1.6 tons of meat every single month. It's up to them whether they use this meat to host functions or whether they sell it and use the revenue realized from the sale of the meat to maintain schools, clinics and that in the area. It's the chiefs and the communal leadership that decide that. We just give them the meat, which is a direct spin-off from the hunting. It pays off in the long run because not only are they reaping a benefit from the Conservancy and the hunting operations here, but it also enables us to police the area better, because any poacher that is caught from that community poaching is then taken through the chief's court. We don't take them through the criminal courts and the police. We take them through the chief's courts. They are then asked to compensate for the value of the animal they've killed, and that compensation value goes back to the community kitty, which is controlled by the chiefs. We found this works very well. The locals don't resent us for this. It's far more efficient. The people can't default at court. They discipline by their own traditional leadership in the communal lands. Don't have to serve prison terms, but they are always expected to compensate for whatever losses they've incurred to the wildlife on the Conservancy. And all of the compensation they pay go back to the community and not to the Conservancy. It's a very, very good way of working things, and we find that we've actually had an unreal cooperation. It's been amazing. The Conservancy also allows the opportunity for a number of different research projects to be conducted. Any person that comes to us with reasonable research projects have been entertained, and even if it doesn't directly benefit us in hunting, we allow them the opportunity to use this unique wildlife area to conduct any meaningful wildlife research.
The lion was the last of the big 5 animals to be reintroduced into the Conservancy. The lion's prey base numbers, primarily buffalo, had to increase to a sustainable level before lion could be brought in.
The lion were brought on and confined in an 80,000 acre area that was fenced off from the rest of the Conservancy. There were 9 males and 7 females originally brought in 1998 and kept in this 80,000 acres. They never really thrived, although there was sufficient prey species, because it was just a too small an area for them to establish a significant population. The buffalo populations, once they had improved to levels that was considered now viable for us to release the lion, we took down the dividing fence, and the lion were able to free roam the whole of the Conservancy. That was in the early 2002, 2003, and since then their population has climbed at an amazing rate. From those 17 founder animals and another 5 that were introduced just to get genetic diversity, we now, from spore transect results, have one of the highest concentrations of lion in Zimbabwe and possibly in southern Africa. And we've now reached the stage where the lion population has to be managed. We've actually got a researcher in from Oxford University to research the lion, but over the last 2 years it's become apparent that we cannot hold any more lion than we are currently. They're starting to kill each other. They can't disperse because of the quality of the game fence, so they have to beat out their dominance within the game fence. So the only way of now controlling this is either by offering the excess animals through hunting, or going in and just culling and burying them, sort of thing. So obviously the best option is to hunt them, and then the revenue from that helps protect other species like rhino, which we're not allowed to hunt here, but we have a very large rhino population, most of which are animals that belong to the government, and we're just acting as custodians for them. But we have to foot the bill for their protection, and that bull at the moment is being helped by the lion hunting, which are the highest value hunts that we actually conduct here.
Paul Trethoin is a Rhodes Scholar with Oxford University's Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, Wild Crew.
I got involved with a research group called Wild Crew, Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at Oxford University, basically through the Wanky Lion Project, which is a long-term lion research project that's been run by Dr. Andrew Loveridge. When I started, I became quite interested in Bubye Valley just because it's interesting from any research project that's looking at behavior, because the habitat is just much better suited to seeing animals, observing them and recording that kind of data. But for other reasons, it's a fully fenced conservancy, so there is no dispersal beyond the limits of the conservancy boundaries. So it's a unique set of circumstances in that respect to look at a large lion population. It's also a hunted population, so that brings an extra dynamic into my research, which is on lion social behavior, social organization. It's like looking at the pride structure under a microscope. So how do those fine-scale interactions affect individuals, even on a physiological level? I'm using a tool known as social network theory, which is basically the maths behind Facebook, to look at the significance of individuals, where they fit into a network structure, how that might influence their own behavior, or whether their behavior influences where they fit into that network, and what are the potential benefits and costs of occupying a specific position in a social network. For example, we might imagine that it's beneficial to be a very central individual in a network, but there might also be costs in terms of disease, parasites, and just the burden of having to interact with many individuals. On the other hand, there might be a psychological advantage that can translate into actual fitness. Most traditional lion studies have been done, particularly behavior, have been done in large protected areas where you don't have fences, you don't have hunting, and it's very likely that in the future those circumstances are not going to be typical of the majority of lion populations, it's likely that most lion populations will have to be fenced in the future. So I think it's very important to understand how lions react to that unique set of circumstances. Lions were introduced here after this conservancy changed from cattle to wildlife in 1994. There was a small number, about 17 lions were introduced, only 5 of which were females. And that population has grown very, very rapidly, which it's an excellent example of how quickly lions can breed if they are given adequate protection and an adequate prey base. So that population is, I believe, in the excess of 200 now, which is less than 20 years later. It's been fantastic actually working in a hunting area in terms of the management team here are really excellent. They really allow me to fit in and work together. I like to think what we're doing is interesting for them and important. They definitely take into account what we come up with. The hunters have been really quite helpful in terms of collecting data, reporting sightings, lion kills. From my point of view, I'm very much in favor of them just getting on and carrying on as though I'm not there. And I don't want to be looking at a special set of circumstances where they're behaving differently because I'm in the area, and they tend to just carry on as they would normally. It's a very professional outfit, so I think it works quite well.
Lions do come with problems. You can't control what they eat, so they tend to eat some of your more expensive species, sable, buffalo and that, but that's just one of the things you have to put up with. For a big male lion to reach maturity and old hunting age, he must eat his way through a couple of $1,000 worth of other game to attain that size and age. We insist that all trophy males are old males, no longer pride males, so that the disturbance is kept to a minimum. What a lot of people don't realize is that in Africa, without hunting, wildlife is just a source of protein. If there's no value on the wildlife, there's no need to protect it. And here definitely is a perfect example of how hunting has enabled a huge wildlife area to be put together, established and sustained. If a ban, there's talk of ban on lion hunting, if that were to be put in place, it would be a very similar scenario. Lions come with their expenses and their problems. If you can't hunt them, we wouldn't need to maintain a population this size, or it wouldn't be viable to maintain a population this size. And because there's no real secure areas that you can move lion to, you can't just uplift the pride and put it into an area to augment numbers, because they're very territorial animals, and the chances are any pride that's moved into an existing wildlife area with lion would just end up in conflict, and they'd end up culling each other. So translocation of lion, unless it's into an absolute new area with no lion at all, is not viable. So if they were to put some ban or some legislation in place to restrict lion hunting, it would mean that they would become an actual problem here. We wouldn't be able to give them away for restocking. We wouldn't be able to sell them to anything, so we would then have to start managing them, culling prides, knocking the numbers right down. It would be very retrogressive. The whole economy of the ranch and all the development and everything has been funded by the hunting. It's a fantastic area now and can boast the big five, and there's very few areas that you can see the big five in the wild in the course of a 7 to 10 day hunt. It's, however, not really suitable for photographic tourism because it has no trump cards. It doesn't have Vic Falls or Zimbabwe ruins or Lake Kariba or anything that would really draw clients to this area. So they've tried cattle. It's not suitable for cropping, and the best land usage is obviously proved to be hunting. The shareholders have been very responsible, and all of the hunting revenue has actually gone back into the property for improvements, improved water points, restocking of species. They haven't made any profits out of the hunting since the Conservancy was established 15 years ago. But at some stage, it's going to have to be of some benefit to them. And without the revenue that's brought in by the hunting, obviously that wouldn't be possible. This is not a trust, this is a business. And if the wildlife hunting is ever non-viable by banning of hunting or banning of certain species, then they would probably have to relook at maybe returning it to cattle, and the whole circle would go again. It took 100 years to establish this cattle ranch, and it's taken us 20 years to take down the infrastructure and reintroduce everything that was originally shot out. So without the hunting, it would end up doing that big circle again and probably have to go back to cattle ranching.
It was on private land that the technically and economically robust model for game ranching was first developed, is still being improved upon, and from where it can be introduced into the peasant farming areas. Without the research and development undertaken on wildlife conservancies, it would be impossible to launch the concept among small-scale farmers who, like those anywhere in the world, lack the economic reserves to take risks. They cannot abandon age-old practices until the new possibilities have been fully tested, even if the alternatives promise to be financially and environmentally superior. Game ranching preserves biological diversity and natural landscapes outside of formally protected government-controlled areas, while also enhancing rural production. It is also an initiative in which Africa has a comparative economic advantage over the rest of the world because of the continent's spectacular wildlife. By rejecting a protectionist, non-consumptive philosophy and recognizing the financial value of game animals, economic forces have been stimulated to conserve wildlife. Countries with growing human populations dependent on an agrarian economy can either spread or intensify existing land uses. Alternatively, they can encourage a more efficient use of the strictly limited amount of energy that can be harvested sustainably from renewable resources. With accelerating desertification, in spite of considerable investment in agricultural research and extension, there is little choice. The Bubye Valley Conservancy is one of the most ambitious, self-sustaining private sector initiatives for wildlife conservation in Africa today. It is not reliant on donor or government handouts for its existence. It is an extremely efficient game sanctuary with a comprehensive management plan which includes detailed research projects. It also provides a land use model not only for Zimbabwe but the whole of Africa and beyond. But it is reliant on sport hunting for its survival. If the sport hunting of lion is effectively banned through the listing of the species on the US Endangered Species List, then the whole enterprise will be hamstrung with dire consequences, not only for the lion population, but also for all the resident wildlife species and the human communities in the surrounding areas.